Hello, everyone. This is Dr. David Glassner, Superintendent of Schools.
Hi, everyone. Erica Merritt with Equities Group, serving as the district's equity partner.
We're just going to wait a few minutes for folks to join our educational equity chat, and then we'll get started. I can see some people joining.
Mm-hmm.
Hello again, everyone. Good evening. This is David Glassner, Superintendent of Shaker Heights Schools. We're just waiting a few minutes for folks to join our educational equity chat, and then we will get started. All right, we're going to get started. Again, welcome. Good evening. My name is David Glassner, Superintendent of Schools. We are very excited to engage with our community through this educational equity chat. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. This is our first Facebook Live event, and we're excited to connect with our Facebook community and facilitate this discussion on educational equity and the district's educational equity policy.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Erica Merritt, and I am founder and principal consultant with Equities Group and serving as the district's equity partner. Some of you have sent some questions ahead, but not to worry. If you haven't had a chance to share a question with us, you can use the chat function to ask a question, and we're going to do our very best to answer as many questions as possible.
So before we get started, I would just like to share a little bit of background on the evolution of the district's educational equity policy, and then Erica will talk a little more about implementing the policy. As most of you know, Shaker Heights has a long history with equity, race, and integration. In 1970, the district received national recognition for the Shaker Plan, which was a voluntary integration plan of our schools. 2 decades later, our high school established pioneering programs such as Mac Scholars and Mac Sister Scholars and the Student Group on Race Relations. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and the district began its implementation of the International Baccalaureate program, so that today we are one of only 8 IB pre-K through 12 districts in all of North America. We are also a proud founding member of the Minority Student Achievement Network, which just celebrated its 20th anniversary. 2 years ago, the district established the Equity Task Force, and the groundwork that group laid ultimately led to the adoption of our first policy on educational equity. To build on this previous work, when I became superintendent this past summer, I articulated Black student excellence and school climate and culture as priority areas of focus for the district. With Erica's help, I've reached out to community members to continue our conversations around equity with a series of small group and community-wide discussions. Many of you who are parents to students in the district also know about our one-to-one Chromebook initiative, which seeks to eliminate the digital divide among our students. And finally, and very recently actually, we have started to form a Black Teacher Task Force to help support and drive the recruiting and retention of Black teachers and staff members in our district. All of these efforts, combined with our educational equity policy, will drive our new strategic plan, which we expect to implement for the next school year. And it will be the catalyst for revisioning and reinventing education for today and beyond. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
So this is where I come in, and a lot has happened since I came on board. My work with the Shaker School District actually began 2 years ago, initially working with the Equity Task Force, and I was really honored this past August to come on as an embedded consultant in the district, supporting the equity work. And so we started actually by having some conversations with the community through something that we called equity salons. So we had conversations with people, many of whom have been engaged in some form or fashion in some of the equity work, whether that was through the Equity Task Force or whether that was through one of the leading equity cohorts. And that has really helped us think about how do we, continue to further this work. And one of the ways that we are doing that is through offering a variety of opportunities for the community to engage with us, and also by launching the Educational Equity Implementation Advisory Team. Say that really quickly 5 times. And the purpose of that group is really to continue the work where the groundwork has been laid already by the wonderful people who were engaged in the Equity Task Force, and really move from this as equity as a concept to how do we actually implement this in practice in the district. So how do we embed it and make it a part of the everyday experience of everyone who works in the district, but most importantly, our students. And that's sort of where we land here. And our Equity Task Force is, we got an overwhelming response. We got, it was a wonderful surprise, actually. I think I said, sorry. So the Implementation Advisory Team, we got 137 applications, which says something about how engaged and committed this community is to this very important work. And we have a team of 30, I believe 35 or 36 people when we include the folks who were chosen, and then also the people who are already a part of the district work. So together we form the implementation team.
Thank you, Erica. I also just want to say how fortunate we are to have Erica here as an equity partner, really helping and supporting our district in these efforts. With that, we're going to start answering some of your questions. Some folks provided us with questions in advance, so we'll start with those and then answer additional questions as they come up.
All right, so why don't we begin at the beginning? And our first question was, how can people who are interested, community members who are interested, facilitate the participation of others? Essentially, how can people be engaged in this work, whether they have children in the district or not?
So first of all, we really appreciate the support and investment and input of our community in our schools, and particularly around issues related to equity, especially given the history and tradition of progressive advocacy and action when it comes to issues around race and integration in our schools from our community. We really want to make sure that there are many ways for our community to engage in the conversation and the work that we're doing related to equity. For that reason, we've held a number of community events. For example, last week we held a book dialogue co-sponsored by our Shaker Heights Teacher Association, where we discussed the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. We've also held Let's Get Real About Race workshops. We're also hosting a World Cafe related to have a discussion with a larger group of our community members around race, equity, and inclusion. So there are really many different ways for our community members to get involved. And I really want to let everybody know that we really do appreciate your input and expertise and feedback in this process. I think one of the things I learned from the really large amount of interest we got in the educational equity policy implementation team was how many members of our community we have, and we're lucky to have, who have not just interest in this work, but a lot of expertise, experience, background. And so it's really exciting to have our community engage in this work.
Absolutely. All right. So our next question centers around this concept of detracking. And so this person wants to know if detracking is a goal of the strategic planning process.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I know we sent out an educational equity update right before winter break. And that has gotten, I know there's been some discussion about this question of detracking since that update. And so I'm glad to be able to address it here. When we talk about this issue, first of all, I want to say that it's a very complex issue, and we're certainly not the only district who is wrestling with or trying to address issues related to tracking. There are a couple of things that I want everybody to know. First of all, here in Shaker, we start tracking students informally in elementary school, at least as early as 3rd or 4th grade, if not earlier. We start placing students in different course levels more formally by 5th grade, and those course levels really end up staying with the student, or students stay in those course levels for the most part pretty consistently throughout their high school career. And here in Shaker, it is also worth noting that those course levels largely are broken out by racial group. So we generally have white student classes that are made up predominantly, if not entirely, of white students, and classes that are made up predominantly, if not entirely, of Black students. And so when we talk about tracking, I think we also need to recognize that there really is a racial part of this work. And I think we've learned throughout our history here in the United States that separate is not equal. And that's something that we need to address head on. There are a couple of things that I want our community to know when we talk about tracking. First of all, when I talk about tracking with our community members, this is not, or detracking, I should say, thinking about how we can reduce or eliminate course levels. This is not an idea that I came up with by myself. I've heard about the issues related to tracking from many of our community members, from our teachers, from our students. In fact, the Shakerite recently ran an opinion piece about challenges related to tracking and race just a couple of weeks ago. So this is an issue that I think has broad traction across our community. The other thing is, when I talk to people about why they live in Shaker and why they're excited to be here, and many people move here intentionally and live here intentionally, it's partly because of the diversity of our community. We are lucky that we have a community that is really demographically diverse, and people are excited to live and work with people of all different backgrounds and races and experiences, and they want their students to have that same kind of experience and education in the schools. And the reality is that in our schools, our students are segregated, and they are not getting that kind of diverse experience that people really do move here for, and that we know will prepare our students for the future. We also need to really be clear about why tracking exists in our district. Tracking, why we started this chat by kind of giving everybody a little bit of the context and history of Shaker, and tracking, or these new course levels, really emerged in response to efforts around integration. And really, just to be clear, white families wanted to create different course levels so that classes could remain segregated. Actually, I will give a shout out to one of our Shaker residents, who's also a professor at Cleveland State, Ann Coletta, who has written a lot about this work and has researched Shaker Heights, and has written about the different educational privileges that emerged in response to integration. And so when we talk about tracking, we cannot ignore the fact that tracking is really part of a system of institutional racism that we need to address directly and heads on. Where do we start? Here in Shaker, we start tracking students and separating them into course levels at very young ages, as I mentioned. And those course levels really remain with students, or students remain in those course levels really throughout their educational careers. And so we are setting pathways for students as early as 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade that determines their educational outcomes and really their life outcomes through 12th grade and beyond. So that's a pretty powerful thing to realize, that we're locking students into specific pathways that carry through them throughout their ultimately high school and graduation careers. I do think that we need to start at the very young ages and see what are we doing to create these tracks or to segregate students early on, and how can we make sure that all of our students are engaged in diverse and challenging classes. I think it's also really important to directly address that our goal is to make sure that all of our students have access to enriching curriculum, targeted instruction, individualized supports. We expect that we will really be challenging and enriching or providing enriching curriculum for more of our students if we're able to create diversity within our classes. One of the other things that I just want to address head on, some people have asked me, does this mean that we're getting rid of enrichment classes, particularly in 5th grade, around that age? And, I think the answer is we don't know yet. I do know that the kinds of learning experiences that our students have in enriched classes is the kind of learning experiences we want all of our students to have in our enriched classes. And I see this in grade level classes as well, but we know that in our enriched classes, our students have access to robust and rigorous curriculum. They're asked to solve real world problems. They work in teams. They use technology as tools to solve those problems. Those are the kind of learning experiences that we want to make sure that all of our students have. And I think we're lucky because we have some examples and exemplars of what those classes can look like for all of our students here in this district. So we need to encourage and support more of that happening in our district. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Erica.
Yeah. I think, so I actually think that your answer was very comprehensive.
We've been talking about it a lot. So.
Yeah, we have. So I will not, I won't add anything at this time.
All right. I see we just got a question.
Yeah, we have a question. So
do you want to read it out loud for everybody?
Sure. So Lisa, thank you for your question. The question is about when will we share who are the members of our equity implementation team and their core work. Yes.
All right. Well, do you want to answer the question? You want me to?
I was actually, I can tell you very soon. When will the documents be? We literally just had this conversation, so I'm looking at you because I don't know.
So the educational equity policy implementation team, we have now publicized all the members of the team. We shared that in a board packet last week, and it's now up to date on our website. I encourage everybody to go to our website, shaker.org. We have a separate section of our website dedicated to equity. You'll see a tab right at the front and center of our website if you go there, and you'll see that all the members of our educational equity policy implementation are listed there. And we really do thank all of our community members who are participating on that team. It really is a powerful and very interesting group of people. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the work that we expect the team to
Yeah, so I guess the phrase that comes to mind most immediately is thought partner. So we understand that the implementation process really is going to live with people who work for the district, right? Who are responsible for the daily work, and we understand that we need the input. We need input beyond just people who are in the district, and so the people who are on the implementation team are really poised to support that team, the folks internally, as thought partners. A few of the things that we are focused on at the moment and forward-looking will be one of them that comes up often is our equity tool. That is a commitment that we've made and something that we are working toward, and expect that this team will be very engaged in supporting us in the development of that tool.
Can you explain what an equity tool is, or what it might be used for?
Sure. So essentially an equity tool is an acknowledgement that on our own, bias can come into our decision making. So it is a way to support us in making equity a habit by asking questions, whether we're looking at our budgeting process, whether we're looking at program development, whether we're looking at curriculum. But it really is a set of prompts, of questions, of measures that will keep us kind of focused on equity and make sure that we are implementing the policies and practices with fidelity. And I think that the way it'll be used will depend on who it is that's using it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the general idea behind an equity tool. Another thing, we know that as much as I am enjoying this work, I'm really excited that ultimately the district is making a commitment to bring on a permanent equity partner. And we expect that this team will also be helping us think about that as well. So there are sort of predefined ways in which we expect this team to engage, and then there are things that we know will continue to evolve.
I know another part of that question was wanting to make sure that the policy is helping guide our allocation of resources and the way that we kind of use our finances and other supports and resources in our district. The equity tool, I would imagine, will help us do that and really make sure that when we look at our budgetary expenses and the resources that we provide for schools, that we're doing that through a lens of our educational equity policy. The other thing I would add to this conversation is that we're also in the process of putting together our strategic plan. And this idea of strategic allocation of resources in a way that through the lens of our educational equity policy is also part of our strategic planning process. In fact, we know that really the two pillars of our future strategic plan we expect to be our educational equity policy and our international baccalaureate program, which really go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And so I would expect that we're also going to be, we've already started talking about the resources that we have and how we use them as part of the strategic planning process also.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have another question. So our question, thank you, Vicki, for your question. Is your goal for the 2021 school year a radical change in comparison to what we have today?
Got it. Thank you for the question. I think part of the answer to this question depends on
what you consider radical.
What you consider radical, because I think it really depends on people's perspectives. I will say that the educational equity policy intentionally uses the word disrupt, and we've come back to that quite a bit. That I think what we're talking about for the future will require some change that some people may be uncomfortable with. Some people may consider radical, some people may consider it disruption, and some people will consider it not enough. And I think we'll probably find community members and teachers and students who are all across that spectrum. The one thing I will say is that change does require support, and we want to make sure that our teachers and schools are prepared for the changes that are coming as it relates to the educational equity policy. Also, even thinking about resources, an institution like Shaker Heights, where we have a relatively large annual budget and where we have lots of different programming happening across all different grade levels, does require us to make sure that we are reflective and intentional in the changes that we are promoting and suggesting. Like I said, though, I think the question of how radical the changes that have already happened are and how much they will be considered radical in the future partly depends on the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I think the threshold, right, depends on the person.
I will say I do want to be clear that I think there is an urgent need for change. I think it's really urgent that we address the needs of all of our students. One of the things I think a lot about is our students only have one chance to go through our school system, and if they're in third grade, they have only one chance to be in third grade. If they're fourth, and so time is of the essence because we have our students now, and we need to address their needs now, and that's really important. I've shared this story with you before, but I recently had the opportunity to visit Woodbury Elementary School and visited a core class which was made up almost exclusively of Black students. There was one white student in the class, and I was on a tour I was visiting the school with a few other colleagues, and one of my colleagues asked one of the students, "Where are all the white students in this class?" And the student said, well, all the white students are in the enriched class. And it really struck me, that short conversation. What struck me is just the messages that we are sending to students in the way that our school is structured. We talk about our schools. We want our students all of our students and families to really feel like they belong in our schools. And, actually, that's one of the reasons why we started this year with the motto, I am Shaker, because we want every student and every family to feel like they belong here in Shaker. And it struck me when we had that conversation with the students in that class that we're sending messages to students that may let some students know, hey, this group of students is smart, this group of students is advanced or enriched, this group of students is maybe not as smart or not as enriched or not advanced. And we have to really make sure we address those messages. We have to make sure we are addressing those messages and changing the messages we're sending. It's urgent. We have to do it. I think there's an imperative, a moral imperative for us to do it. So I just wanted to make sure that was also part of the conversation.
Yeah. There's so much in that in terms of even my own experience of just walking through the halls, to be able to make a guess just by looking through a doorway what class is happening in any given room based on the racial makeup of students without hearing a word from the teacher or from the students in the class is very telling.
Yeah.
And while, I might not get that guess right every time, a pretty significant amount of the time, it is the advanced courses that are filled with white students and absent Black students, and the way in which that shapes and reinforces, right, the thinking around intellectual capacity and race is very disturbing.
Yeah.
All right, so we have another question. I think it's from Saida. Thank you for that. Why not retrack in grades 5, 7, and 9 when a child is prepared to return to rigor?
So thank you very much for the question. I think there are many different ways that we can address tracking and course leveling. If I understand the question correctly, this question is intended to mean could we revisit course level decisions at specific benchmarks in a child's academic career? That may be something that we can do. I will say the research shows that once students are in tracks, even if that there's very little mobility between tracks. And I think even if and we're not the only district who says this, but even if we say that the grade level or core level class is designed to prepare students for the advanced class, that's not always the case. And sometimes students wind up falling farther behind rather than catching up. Again, that's not unique only to Shaker. I think that is the experience of other districts around this country. I do think Saida brings up a good point that there are different ways that we can address course leveling. And I think that's one of the harder questions that we have to answer as we move forward with this work.
I think there was another question. DeAndrea is asking, what are key measures of success? So how will we know that we have achieved success?
Fantastic question. And as you can probably imagine, there's not an easy answer to this question. I think traditionally, school districts, including Shaker, have really focused on the achievement gap as a critical measure of success, which is essentially trying to determine how Black students perform in comparison to white students, Black students and other racial subgroups, I should say. I think the more we're learning, we are learning how insufficient the achievement gap as a measure is, and also how the achievement gap also has either explicit or implicit undertones of racism built into it. Again, I would highlight the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, which talks about this topic at length. I do think that we have to make sure that our measures of success look at each student individually and that we're looking at multiple data points to measure our success. So, for example, there are qualitative data points that we collect about our students and families' experiences in our schools. Starting with our current strategic plan, the one that we're under, we did start kind of a climate survey for our students and families that we give at periodic intervals in a student's experience. I think we need to look at that kind of data to see, do our students feel like they belong? Do they feel safe in our schools? Do they feel like they're challenged in their classes? That kind of data is important. We also have to look at academic achievement data and academic achievement measures to see how our students are doing. There are strengths and flaws with each academic achievement measure, but that is also part of the conversation when we think about how we measure the success and the effectiveness of the work we're doing, particularly as it relates to equity. Eric, I don't know if you have anything to add about how we might measure this.
I think that your answer kind of there's so many. I think we sometimes have a very narrow perspective about what success is, and the way that we tend to measure that is via testing and other sort of quantitative measures. And I'm sorry, I got distracted because I'm like trying to pay attention to the questions and trying to answer this question at the same time. So I'm going to stop there. And
one other thing that I want to mention, one of our priority areas of focus this year is school climate and culture. And there's also data around school climate and culture that I think also is a measure of our success. Because we know that if our students are having positive experiences in schools, building positive relationships with their peers and with adults, and are being challenged academically, that we're also likely to see positive data as it relates to school culture, climate, and discipline in our schools. So I would add that as another possible measure of success.
And you're saying that actually makes me think about, so when we were talking about this the other day, one of the things we talked about was how important it is, how there's more and more data to support that having a positive racial identity impacts student performance, particularly for younger students. And so thinking about how important this is in the climate piece, again, having education be an affirming experience, not one where you feel like you're being marginalized, and thinking about the way in which that then could negatively impact performance.
Thank you.
All right, so Jessica would like to know, what additional training will the teachers be given to prepare them to be successful with these changes? It's a great question.
Thank you, Jessica, for this question. It is a great question, and I appreciate Jessica's question because it really does speak to the need for us to be proactive in helping make sure we're all prepared for these changes. And I would only expand the question to include teachers, administrators, other staff members in our district. Because
anyone who comes into contact with students.
Really, we're talking about broad changes for our students and for our school environments, and so I think it's important that we're all prepared. One of the things that I noticed when I took on this role about 6 months ago was that we had supported fantastic training opportunities for our community members, led by Erica and some of your partners, these intensive Leading for Equity trainings, along with other community workshops. And it really felt like we need to play catch up a little bit for our staff to play catch up. And so earlier this fall, we started a Leading for Equity cohort training for district leaders, including myself, the Board of Education, and other district leadership, 2.5-day intensive training opportunity around race, equity, and inclusion. We're having another cohort start tomorrow, which is fantastic, for additional district staff. And one of the things we've talked about is the need to be able to scale this kind of opportunity more broadly for all of our teachers and other staff. And so we've talked about how we can do that in a way that makes sense. I think there are also a couple of other things that I want to highlight here. I think one of the things I've seen is that it's important to provide many different ways for teachers and staff and administrators and community members to engage and enter this conversation. That's one of the reasons why I've been so thrilled that our Shaker Heights Teachers Association has helped sponsor this book dialogue, because that's one way that our teachers can and have engaged in conversations around equity. And we know we need to do more of that as we move forward. The other thing, I think, whenever we talk about change in an organization, I think there's always a balance between engaging the quote-unquote coalition of the willing, or when we talk about technology, sometimes we talk about early adopters, while also making sure we're getting to people who maybe aren't the early adopters, who maybe aren't so willing at the outset. I think we're trying to build a critical mass here in our district of people who have a shared understanding of what educational equity means, how that might have an impact or an effect on the work that's happening in our schools, and then building out from there. And we know we need to continue to provide multiple opportunities for staff to learn.
I think the other thing that I would add quickly is, and this is from someone who loves and values deeply professional development, it's not magic, right? And so on the one hand, we need to make sure that we are providing educators and others with the resources that, whether that's through professional development or otherwise, to support the implementation of these shifts that we're talking about. And we know how important we need to, the ways in which we might need to interrupt ourselves in the terms of policies and practices as well, which is why I think the policy itself is so important, because we really need both. I think that if we were to train everyone tomorrow, I think that people would be disappointed with the results of that alone. Mm-hmm. It's going to require more than that.
That's a great point.
All right. So Christine has a question about what are we concerned about behavior and lack of control of kids in classes where kids are there who really want to learn. So I'm thinking, my understanding is that she's wanting to know, how do we navigate balancing the needs of kids who maybe are not being as focused or might be disruptive in class with those that are really engaged and attentive.
Thank you, Christine, for this question. I have to admit I come from maybe a slightly different starting place, which I believe that all kids at least start out wanting to learn, and all of our kids start out being naturally curious and excited about the opportunity to do well. I wonder sometimes what happens from that starting point to where some of our students end up, and what barriers may exist within our system, or things that we could do to make sure that we're really meeting our students' needs, engaging them, and making sure that they have positive experiences. I will say, though, that Christine's question is one of the reasons why we identified school climate and culture as one of our priority areas of focus for this year, because we know that having a positive learning environment has a direct correlation with academic achievement. And so how do we create that positive learning environment? We want to make sure that we're very intentional about students building relationships, positive relationships with each other and with adults in their buildings and in their classes. We also know that it's really important that we're very intentional and deliberate about teaching our students social and emotional learning skills so that they can navigate challenging situations using those social and emotional skills. And that will have an impact on all students in the classroom. I also think it comes back a little bit to this idea of belonging, that we want all of our students to feel like they belong in our schools and in their classes. And sometimes when students don't feel like they belong, we see, poor behavior, or students who are not necessarily as engaged as we want them to be, and that is a challenge. But all that being said, we want to make sure that all of our students are able to focus and learn in their classes.
So I actually think that's an easy segue to one of the other questions that we got before today, and that is, what is the district's plan to deal with the rate of African American students who are being suspended versus white students?
Great question, and I agree, very related. And I think we are and need to address this issue on multiple fronts. First of all, this idea of creating a positive learning environment for all of our students is really important. And we were intentional about articulating two priority areas of focus: Black student excellence and school climate and culture together, because we know that we have there's disproportionality when it comes to exclusionary discipline consequences for our students. You mentioned policy earlier, and I think the educational equity policy and our educational equity tool that we will adopt will help us examine our disciplinary policies through a lens of equity. I also think that we need to look at kind of the overall system of supports that we provide to students and make sure that we have multiple tools in our toolbox to address incidents and issues that relate to discipline. In education lingo, sometimes we call this multi-tiered systems of support, or positive behavior, intervention structures, restorative practices falls into this. We want to make sure that we really provide different ways of engaging with our students so that even when there are challenging incidents or behaviors, we are making sure that we give our students an opportunity to learn and grow from those experiences, and that ultimately we change behavior so that we have positive classroom environments.
I think just really quickly, so you mentioned both the climate and culture piece and the Black Student Excellence piece, and I think it's worth mentioning, hopefully everybody read the equity update, but for the few people who didn't have a chance to read that, which I'm sure there are maybe one or two people out there who didn't read the update, but I think it's worth mentioning again that that focus on excellence is really about what the district needs to shift, right? The ways in which the district needs to operate differently in order to support Black student excellence. And, there's been a thread around Black student empowerment as well. And our belief, I think it's important to emphasize how important we think that is, right? To create the kind of climate and culture where Black students do feel empowered.
Yeah, great. We are getting a note from our producers here that
We
there
have
is only
20 minutes
left and there are lots
Yes.
of questions. We will continue to try to answer our questions while going as thoroughly as possible, but also as quickly as possible.
Okay, so from Juliana, we have, what does it take to make systemic changes that are comprehensive and lasting? What guides your understanding of change that works? Wow, that's a simple question. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I hear that question, the first word that comes to mind is actually intention.
Mhm.
And not just intention alone, intention with action behind it. But I think it takes a huge degree of focus and attentiveness to what it is that you are trying to change. And you have to like we're talking about shifting a system, right? And so I think that the minute that you focus on something else, there's a way that things slide backwards. And so it's going to take, this is going to have to be an ongoing focus. And I think that's what's so exciting to me about having it embedded in the strategic plan, because there are going to be concrete measures around it in a way in which we'll continue to zero in on it consistently.
I would agree. The word that comes to my mind is vision.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is similar to what you were saying, that we need to be very clear about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to change. I also know that in my experience, it really takes committed groups of people to make sure that change happens. And that's one of the reasons why we're so lucky in Shaker, because we do have committed groups of people who I think are authentically committed to change in relation to educational equity. And the last thing I think is a willingness to jump into the unknown, be a little bit afraid and confront that fear. I think that's part of change also, that we're doing something that we haven't done before, and that comes with it a certain amount of fear or trepidation that we have to be willing to be okay with. I know sometimes in sessions I've been with, you talk about being comfortable with the uncomfortable. I think that is also part of change.
I think that's right. Sarah has a question. We have so many questions. I'm like, okay, which one? How will targeted universalism be implemented to allow for different goals for different students?
Great question. I'm glad that somebody introduced the term. Sarah brought up the term targeted universalism. That's part of our educational equity policy. And really, targeted universalism is what Sarah described, which is that we're providing specific resources to meet the needs of specific groups of students. Some examples, I think we've started moving in this direction. Some examples of that, for example, might be articulating Black student excellence as a priority area of focus, because we're really making sure that we're focusing on a specific group of students that maybe needs, that we need to do in order to meet their needs. I think also this is, and it's going to be a long-term conversation, but when we talk about how we use our resources and making sure that we're meeting the needs of students, this is what targeted universalism is all about. Are we, right now we maybe are providing resources to all students, which is great, or specific resources to all students, and we need to provide specific resources to specific students. But I think it's going to be part of the process of implementing our strategic plan and our educational equity policy.
Yeah, I think it's essentially about setting a goal and then thinking about how you have to operate differently to get different groups of students to that goal, right? So the way that you get an English language learner to proficiency might be different than someone for whom that's their native language, and we're acknowledging, right, that the support that Black students need in this case, or the way in which we need to be thinking about that differently, deserves calling out.
Yeah, great.
Okay, we have Emily and Stacy are asking about addressing your goals for pre-K and how it will provide outreach and cost-free access to families. And then how did the equity policy inform the change with pre-K?
Great question. We're very excited about our preschool offerings and know that we want to be able to offer even more of our preschool offerings to our community because it is such a high quality program. A couple things I want to make sure that everybody's clear on. We continue to provide a very low cost option for students and families that need preschool. It's very similar to what we've done in the past. In the past, we provided scholarships for families who needed scholarships to participate in our preschool program and our early childhood programming. Now we're just providing a discount. So it's really the same. The impact is the same, which is that preschool will remain very low cost for students and families in need. And it really mirrors the way that we work with families that are eligible for free and reduced meals in kindergarten through 12th grade. So that's why we made that change. The question about how our equity policy informed our changes to the preschool program, I think is a great question. One of the things that we noticed is that up until now, we had very limited options for students with disabilities, and we weren't really providing the diverse, heterogeneous experience that we want for all of our students across all of our early childhood offerings. And so now, with these changes, we're going to have a range of options and really a continuum of services for our students, our general education students and our students who have IEPs. And we can now provide that with both with a half-day program and a full-day program. So we're excited about that. And I will say, the changes we're making now, we're really making with an eye to the future because we want to create a model that is both sustainable and expandable. And I think the changes that we're implementing for next year will allow us to continue to do that.
There was another question, I think it's the last question that we got ahead of time, about the way in which resources or opportunities for support are provided to students that are at or above grade level over the summer, but not anything for students who are not, below grade level.
Tell me if I'm not answering this question, but okay. The way I understand that question is talk a little bit about our offerings over the summer and how we can meet all students' needs. A couple of years ago, we started our Summer Enrichment Learning and Fun program, our SELF program over the summer, which really was designed to meet the needs of all students. Over the past few years, we've recognized the need to add or modify some programs, change some programs. That process is ongoing and continuous, and we continue to hope to meet the needs of all of our students, really across all different ranges, demographic areas over the summer, and also hope to continue that work over the course of the year too. We're very excited about our SELF program, and we're looking forward to rolling it out for this upcoming summer.
Where would you say that Bridges fits into?
Great question. So our Bridges program was designed to help support the enrollment of underrepresented groups, students of color predominantly, in our advanced courses at the high school. That is a summer program that carries on with supports throughout the year. And that is a great example of a program that I think we'd love to see expand and replicate at other grade levels.
Okay, Nicole says that she's noticed some high school classes have a mix of honors and core students taking the same class for different credit. Do these provide any indication of how detracking or less tracking would work?
Thank you, Nicole, for that great question. I think that is certainly an example or model of how detracking might work. And we're fortunate because it's a model we have here in our own building. So there are things I think we've learned from having that model at the high school. And it's one model, not the only model. I think that is, for example, some of our design classes at Woodbury and at the middle school. We've seen in those classes students of all different levels working together to solve challenges or solve problems and do really exciting work. That's another model. I think both have merits, both have drawbacks, both have lessons that we can learn from them. And there are other models out there that I think we can also look at as we continue this conversation.
Okay. So we have a question from Carmela, and Carmela would like to know if restorative practices be a tool used across the district to address behavior and relationship building?
Thank you, Carmela, for that great question. The short answer is yes. I think restorative practices is a tool that we can use to support relationship building and creating positive learning environments. I think I've learned a lot about restorative practices over the past few years, and one of the understandings that I've come to appreciate is that restorative practices is a piece of a larger whole. It needs to be within restorative practices is most effective when it's under the umbrella of an entire school and district-wide effort to create a positive learning environment. One of the things that we learn in restorative practices training is that 80% of the work in restorative practices has to be proactive. That means that we have to create relationships in advance. We have to be very intentional about those relationships and about implementing structures that help our students learn social emotional skills and navigate social situations. And then when an incident happens or there's harm done, we have that relationship and those structures to fall back on. And I think that's the greatest strength of restorative practices and also the greatest challenge, because I think we're often tempted to use restorative practices reactively when we really need to focus on how we can implement restorative practices and other similar systems of support proactively. I also think restorative practices by itself is not the only solution. We also have to include more broadly ways that we can create positive relationships with our students.
All right. Okay, Vicky has a question. How can we equip our teachers and staff to manage their biases?
Great question. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about professional learning and support. I think we all come to the conversation, whether that's teachers, staff, administrators, community members, with our own experiences, background, and biases. I know in my own experience, always reflecting and learning from the conversations we're having, whether that's very intentional work like going through a book study with our community or participating in workshops or having conversations, informal conversations with you, with our community members, with students, and learning from their experiences, something we always all have to be open to. I think ultimately, like our community members, we need to provide our staff and faculty administrators with many different ways to engage in this conversation, while also setting some clear expectations and a vision for where we're headed so that people can join along.
Yeah, I think one of the really important pieces of that is, and you've heard me say this before, that I think that the conversation about bias has shifted in a somewhat positive way, in that people are more willing today to admit that they have bias, but we still have some work to do to get people to a point of admitting that having bias means that they actually take bias action. And I think that that's still a gap. And so the first step, right, for people is to destigmatize this whole idea behind bias. And then for us to support people in many of the ways that you just described, to be able to go that extra next step to, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to get it wrong. And how do I then recover? How do I recover in a relationship with my colleague? How do I recover in a relationship with students? And to not have that, it makes me think about the Ibram Kendi book.
I was going to say the same thing.
Where, you know,
you beat me to it.
Yeah, because he talks about specifically racism, right? And he talks about it as, you know, we often think about it as some I'm going to call it a character flaw. That's not his language.
Once you're a racist, you're always a racist. Once you're an anti-racist, you're always an anti-racist.
And instead, he is challenging us by saying that we all do racist things. Mm-hmm. And so we need to be able to, one, acknowledge that and then shift behavior. And that neither of those things has to be a permanent state. Yeah.
We're getting the 2-minute warning over here, so I want to make sure we address a few more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Last 2 questions. Mia asks, are there any other indicators Shaker is considering as a part of the equity? This is a great question. Considering as a part of the equity conversation in addition to race, for example, gender and socioeconomics?
Thank you, Mia, for that great question. Yes. Our education equity policy does include a broad number of demographic categories.
Ability, socioeconomics, gender identity, and so on.
Yes. So yes is the short answer. I know we focus predominantly on race tonight, but that is certainly not to mean that we're excluding other groups. And I believe that the strategies that we're talking about as they relate to race are also very important and applicable to other groups of students as well.
Yeah, and I think just saying out loud that educational equity is about ensuring that a student's identity, whether that identity is tied to socioeconomics or ability or some other identity marker, should not be an indicator of their academic success. And that the task of the school district is providing the supports and eliminating the barriers in order to make that happen. And our very last question, Sabrina is asking, what is the district's plan to diversify instructional staff?
Great question. I talked about belonging earlier on, and we know that one of the things that comes with belonging is seeing people like you in different positions and different roles in our school district. That's one of the reasons why we are creating a Black Teacher Task Force to really help us when it comes to issues or when it comes to hiring and retaining a diverse and well-qualified staff. We also know that this process takes time. And I've talked to other professionals in other fields about how to diversify staff. And it is a process because we know that we're recruiting and retaining staff on an ongoing basis. I think we're lucky here in Shaker because we have a lot of networks locally and expertise locally that we can leverage to help us do this. Both among our current staff and among our community members that can really help us diversify our instructional staff.
That's our last question, but not to worry. We are going to answer the remaining questions on shaker.org. So you will have a chance to get answers to the remaining questions in the near future.
Yes, and I would add, that question about staffing was actually very timely because we will be posting for a permanent equity officer on or around February 1st, and that person is also going to be helping us try to figure this out. And so we encourage everybody to share with their friends and with their networks that this position is available, and please send folks our way.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you, Erica. Really enjoyed chatting with you tonight.
Thank you. Bye-bye.